سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح، تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح، وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح، يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح. سبيل الدموع سبيل.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to the next episode in our series of Muslims in non-Muslim lands. And our focus is going to be very much today on applying the tradition Usul in the various Diyar, in the sort of political legal jurisdictions. We're going to explore the concept of a particular land and what ruling it might possess. Because what we found is over the duration of time since the dawn of Islam, we've seen the impact of Islam on the state itself, and in some cases we haven't seen that. Very early on, in fact, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we saw in Mecca a very limited, if in fact hardly any public display of the religion, and clearly no influence whatsoever on the legal and also the political climate. Whereas in a short sort of time period subsequently, we see the impact of the Muslim way of life, if you can call it that, the public display of Islam, the impact of it on the legal system and the political system is very apparent. In fact, it had sort of a literally complete authority over Medina. So we've seen that there is this sort of a difference between the Meccan period, and we see a difference within the Medina period itself. And some have laid claim that the Medina period put to rest the Meccan period and in essence abrogated it, because there was no need now for the Meccan period whatsoever. And that was based on the mindset and the view that Islam was conquering more lands. It was considered as a powerful religion. The people who followed it were considered as powerful. They had already established a literal superpower in the Muslim lands, and the first sort of combat, or the first area where problems arose, was with Islam's sort of relationship towards the, at that time, Christian West. And this has been sort of built upon by individuals from both camps, in that what we see is this big gap between, or this difference, this dichotomy of something referred to as Darul Islam and something referred to as Darul Harb. This is picked up by many Western scholars as well. Lewis, for example, talks about this inherent hostility that exists between the two. So you have Western societies in the West, and Western countries applying Christianity or aspects of Christianity, and whereas you have in the East, Eastern societies in Eastern countries applying Islam. And if we look at it from the Muslim perspective, where we see Islam in the dominancy, where we see Islam where Muslims reside, it is a Darul Islam. And where we see Muslims not residing, where we see potential problem for Muslims, that itself becomes Darul Harb. So we're left with this dichotomy of a land of peace for Muslims. So remember, we're always looking at this from the Muslim perspective, because the series is all about Muslims as minorities in non-Muslim lands. So what you have here is this dichotomy of Muslims living in lands in which they are dominant, they are powerful, they are of the political system, they are of the judicial system, and their religion is being applied in all aspects of human life. And then you have the other side of the world, if I can use that, in which there is no application of Islam whatsoever. In fact, it is anti-Islam. It is Christian-based. It sees its problems with Islam. It doesn't consider Islam as a sound religion. It doesn't accept it. And Muslims aren't very welcome in the non-Muslim lands, referred to as Darul Harb. And likewise, Christians were welcome, in fact, in the Muslim lands, but their religion was obviously curtailed in terms of its practice, relatively speaking, when living in Christian lands. And it seems to be that this is the only way. But what we have seen and what we have presented so far is that there's been many pockets of Muslims living in what can be termed as non-Muslim lands, in which it wasn't considered as Darul Harb as such, where the Muslims were living quite comfortably, being able to practice their religion without much of an impact on what they did and what they could and couldn't do. So there is that open to it. But also what we find in this day and age, living in the 21st century, we also see now that it is not this kind of black and white world anymore. You know, we're seeing, for example, let's take India and Pakistan, for instance. You've got Muslim soldiers fighting for India, and you have a Christian soldiers fighting for Pakistan. So, you know, what would be seen quite strange if it was an us and them type of philosophy, us and them type of attitude, clearly that's not the sign there. And likewise, you might find Muslim soldiers within the Israeli army and Christians amongst the Palestinians who are being targeted in that way with the troubles that are going on within the Middle East. So again, it's not just a black and white us and them type of thing. It's very complicated. The world is a complicated place. As I say, the world is not much black and white anymore. It's lots of greys. But this relationship which existed, and if we focus again particularly on the Muslim lands, the relationship which has existed between religion and state, as in how much of an impact has religion had on state, has also been through some sort of development. It's easy to say at the beginning of Islam, with the Prophet ﷺ, we see that the political power and the religious power is united in one person, without any shadow of doubt, and that was none other than Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He had divine authority to rule the lands, both from a religious perspective and also from a political perspective. Nobody questioned his authority. All those who came under the influence of Islam, without any shadow of doubt, knew that their religion, their religious belief was based upon accepting Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, not only as a leader for the hereafter, but also a leader in this world. So we see that. And we see it similarly happening when the Khulafa and Khulafa Rashidun, as they are referred to, the first four rightly guided Khalifs, and they're referred to as rightly guided, and for a reason. And we see that this political leadership then passed on, and we see also that again, even with Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, and Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu, and Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, we see, and also if we were to include Sayyidina Hassan and even Hussein's involvement, then we see that particularly the first four Khalifs, we see that they are accepted, and it's referred to as the golden period, in which there were, the prophetic political leadership was still seen. So again, there was very little, once matters had been discussed, there was very little doubt about the leadership that came over. I appreciate this is very much from a Sunni Islam perspective. From a Shia Islam perspective, there is a difference of view, but I'm talking from the majority perspective, and my work in particular is focusing from the larger group in order to be able to draw understandings and derive rulings rather than making a historical discussion. So we can see that the individual's sort of religious and political allegiances and alliances and the values, what the offices were inseparable. So we didn't have a kind of the religious leadership and then the political leadership. They were intertwined. There was no difference between either. Now this could be obviously a standard sort of development. We could see, for instance, that because of the size of the community, it was easy to run in that way. It was easy to manage in that way. But there also seems to be a divine reason for this. There also seems to be an understanding behind it, which is why the best of generations is the Prophet ﷺ, and followed by the Sahaba, and followed by the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. So the Prophet ﷺ's time in which the Sahaba were there, that's the first generation. And then the second generation which came after, which is the Tabi'in, and the third generation which came after that, which is the Tabi'in. So these three generations are highly regarded because the moral and religious and political status that the Muslims had was at its elite. And therefore we can see the situation. And there's a narration which is mentioned both in Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood, in which it mentions that the Khilafat after me is 30 years. Al-Khilafatu ba'di 30 sana. 30 years. After which you'll become an unjust kingdom. ثُمَّ تَكُونُ مُلْكًا عَدُودًا. So it will become an unjust kingdom. And we have other versions as well. The Caliphate of the Prophet ﷺ will last 30 years, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the kingdom to whom He wishes, and numerous narrations of that nature. So if we were to sit here and count the number of years of the Khulafa Rashidun as to how long they were, then we see that Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was about 2 years, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was 10, and Sayyidina Usman radiallahu anhu was 12, and Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was 6. So we have 12, 24, and 6 years of Sayyidina Ali. That gets it to 30 years. Some have included the time of Sayyidina Hassan and Sayyidina Hussein within there, but they all have come to 30 years. So it seems that this unique template, that this elite structure of moral guidance, political guidance, judicial guidance, religious guidance, was with one man, one individual, and who was bringing everybody together under his leadership. Now, whatever changed on the ground, whatever made it impossible for that to carry on, whether it was the size of the kingdom or whatever, or the factions which came about, we know that these 30 years was the best years of the leadership after the leadership of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we can see now that the world is changing, that the Khilafat, the leadership which Muslims sought, both political and religious, was changing. And we see that even after the passing of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, which was about 100 years or so, one supreme leader held the head of state as well as the title of Khalif. So, and then it didn't really last long after, even though we've already mentioned that the kingdoms which existed now, it was just normal kingdom, as in passed from father to son. The method which had been used to select the leaders of the Muslim nation, or the fledgling Muslim nation in the first 30 years, had been on merit, had been on individuals who had the suhbah of the Prophet ﷺ, who had spent time in his company, who knew his methods, who obviously of a religious nature, of a piety, of scholarship in all areas, were the elite. They were the top, and as a result they could take on that leadership which the Prophet ﷺ in his absence was now vacant, and a vacuum was building, and they stepped in for that. But we see that within a short space of time it becomes a kingdom like any of the kingdoms, passed on from father to son, and with having said that, still containing the religious identity, still containing the religious side of things as well. But what we were starting to see is that the religious element was slowly being picked up now by another group of individuals, and they were referred to as the ulama, the scholars. So we see the traditional schools being developed in those stages, in the time of the Tabi'in and the Tabi'in. And we see, for instance, the Imam Abu Hanifas of the world, and the Imam Maliks, and the Shafis, and the Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Awza'i, and all the rest of them. We see that development taking place now. Why? Because they were left with the responsibility now to safeguard the religious authority and safe. So we start to see schools, traditional schools. And these traditional schools are the ones who are maintaining the authority, the religious authority. So we're seeing a split taking place now. And so what we find is that they're becoming more and more sort of secular leaders. And I don't mean by secular in the way we understand it now, in the sense that it's anti-religious. No, I don't mean that whatsoever. I mean it's just a sort of a political leadership. It's only receiving religious justification from the ulama. It in itself is not religiously sort of justifying itself. It's a political, it's a non-religious responsibility to ensure that there is a leader, to make sure people are all, there's no anarchy, and there is structure in place. So sultans and the sultanate sort of system came about. They were responsible for defending the population, administrating the state, making sure things were working out. And then what we see is during the Abbasid period, we see the Muslim empire split into two. So we then have the Umayyad and the Abbasid taking place. And then as time goes on, there's further divisions take place. So when the Abbasids lost Spain to the Umayyads, Tunisia to the Aghlabids, and Egypt and Syria to the Fatimids, we're starting to see that really it was a superficial unity that existed, and the Caliph was mentioned in the sermons, and he appeared on the currency. So really, the whole concept of this one individual strong leader bringing all the Muslims together under his authority did not exist, or ceased to exist after a very short period after the passing of the last of the Khulafa, Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu. And in fact, we have within a couple of centuries after that, that three dynasties simultaneously claimed the leadership of the Islamic Ummah, and they were the Umayyads in Spain, the Fatimids in North Africa and the southern part of Arabian Peninsula, and the Abbasids in northern and eastern Arab lands. So you're seeing now, well, who is the actual Khalif? So these were like ordinary rulers who were in charge of the Muslim subjects, who themselves had to adhere to the law. So they were not outside of the law, they didn't make the law. They weren't in a position to derive the law. These were individuals who themselves had to abide by the law, the Sharia, which was being determined by the ulama. So even though the ulama don't have clout as such from a military background, from a political background, their clout was very much in the religious background because of the pious congregations which would surround them. So it was the sultans, if I use the word, rather than Khalif, it was the sultans then who were the leaders who could wage war, make peace, establish treaties, administer their regions, and it was very much a nominal allegiance to the Khalif. So we can't see a supreme leader being responsible for the Muslims after really, a short time after Sayyidina Ali was passing away. It was fought for, and separate states were set up within this so-called monolithic Darul Islam, in that there were also parties sort of fighting against each other themselves within this setup because of power. So it's the schools of laws which are now the ones that are developing and thriving independently. They are the ones who are the graduates of these schools of law are being taken by the state to apply them as qadi, as judges, to establish law. They are there as the teachers, they are there as the religious advisors. So in a sense, the authority is given to the deen, and the experts of the deen are these scholars. So the Khalif statements is no longer a source of law, whereas at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, clearly it was. He was the Prophet, he had divine wahi, revelation. In the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, obviously revelation ceased, but still his position as an authority in the deen, as a religious authority, was second to none, as was the case with the other Khulafa. So this was a different setup altogether now. So the schools of law have separated from the political spheres, and they are developing themselves, and they are also, and the legal system, or the powers that be that want authority, they're developing on their own. So what you find is eventually the Muslims could identify themselves, their political allegiance, and secondly, their religious allegiance. So you're seeing really, at a very early stage in Islam, the double identity which takes place between the Muslim, for the Muslim. That he has a geographical relationship with the Khalif that he happens to be under, whether he's residing in the Sultanate of the Aghlabids, or of the Fatimids, or of the Umayyads, or of the Abbasids, or many other factions which occurred after these. So he has one sort of political allegiance to the place where he resides. Why? Because this place is the one that defends him. Its army goes out to defend him. It administers to make sure the roads are there and services are provided. But also he has a religious authority over him, which is some particular scholar, some particular school of law which he does taqleed to, which he follows. And it's this taqleed that he does, which is his religious identity. And you find that most of the time the two were sort of working together, because the Khalif needed the stamp of approval from the ulama in order for the masses to accept his position as religiously sound. And however, there were times where we see that the religious scholars themselves actually criticized the sultans or the khalifs, depending on which word you want to use. And in fact, the very founders of the four schools of law were the ones who criticized. So we see, for example, Imam Malik ibn Anas and Imam Shafi were both persecuted for the legal positions they took. And we also saw that Imam Abu Hanifa was actually put to death by the Abbasid Khalif Mansur. And we also see that the Khalif Ma'mun, he imposed the Mihna, in which everybody had to accept that the Quran was created. And this was obviously contrary to the accepted traditional view in that the Quran is not created. And a number of scholars stood up against this and faced hardship, and one in particular was Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who, the founder of the Hanbali school, also then stood up, and he was a symbol of opposition against this mihna, and he suffered personally because of this. So here you're seeing is the religious elite actually standing up against the political elite. Now, it doesn't really matter here whether the political elite are Muslims or not Muslims. It's the religious responsibility which the Muslims have chose to live by, which the scholars are providing them that information. And it wasn't just the religious leaders who were persecuted. Many Muslim populations were persecuted, and they had to then take refuge in non-Muslim domains. We see that during Hajjaj ibn Yusuf's sultanate, where Muslims fled to Iraq and India and then had to adopt certain practices in order not to be troubled. So here you can see that the political identity of the Muslims is developing on its own, and the religious identity of the Muslims is developing on its own. Generally speaking, the Khalif kept the scholars happy in trying not to do things which would bring about any fatwa against them. Why? Because in order to maintain the masses following them, they needed the scholars on board. And at the same time, the scholars would work with them in order not to bring about anarchy. But there have been times clearly where that's not been possible, and where the scholars have had to speak up against it, and as a result have suffered at the hands of the sultans themselves. So we're seeing two types of identities, if we can say, of the Muslim community. So one identity is due to the membership based on one belief, in the belief of one God, yani Allah, and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that's exclusively Muslims. So you can see that even though somebody might be living in the Abbasid territory, and some might be living in the Umayyad territory, so territorial, they're living in separate areas. The Abbasids obviously were keen on destroying the Umayyads, because they were the one who disposed them, and the Umayyads then set up base in Spain. So clearly they're one another's enemies politically, but religiously they would be individuals sharing the same beliefs as those people who were living under the Abbasid dynasty, under the Abbasid territory, and those who were living under the Umayyad. And they didn't find any difficulty in being able to hold both sort of identities, one being the identity of religion and the other one identity of being one's political sort of background. So we see that, and we see that developing, and what we've tried to do is sort of use that as a precedent in order to then be able to explain, now that we find in country states or states which are based on nationalism, which was something which came about in the 18th century and sort of developed more so into the 19th century as well, is that nationalism seems to be a key point, a key descriptor of an individual rather than living in which territory. So the territory is now based on nationalism. And these, in some places, arbitrary borders which have come up. In some places they were natural, those which have been naturally allowed to come together, which we see in Europe in particular, where certain ethnic groups have decided to live separately, and as a result the borders seem to make sense. And then they've been somewhat arbitrarily put together in, say, the Middle East in particular, where you're seeing kind of groups of people just being split up for the sake of it, as it just seems a nice place to draw a line on the map. But generally speaking, these nationalism and this has come about. So now we can talk about nation states. So we can extend that understanding that you might find a Muslim living in China, a Muslim living in Spain, and a Muslim living in the US of A, and a Muslim living in, say, Iraq. So they might have a religious identity which they share with others, but they also then have a political identity which they share with those people who reside in that particular territory. And it might be like we saw with the Abbasids and the Umayyads, it might be that they don't necessarily get on too well with each other, or the states don't get on too well with each other, even if the individuals do. And this is touching me onto this concept of nationalism and nation states. Even though this is a relatively new phenomenon, it can easily be understood that country can quite easily mean Dar. Why? Because it's an area of territory which one leader has absolute power, and that's really in essence what a Dar is. So even if we challenge the concept of nation states, and say, well, this is quite alien, it's something which doesn't really exist. What we've found is, obviously, it seems that this is now accepted. We see the concept within Muslim countries, whether we look at Pakistan, Bangladesh, places like that, Saudi Arabia. We're seeing lands where nationalism is seen as something acceptable. Reason being is that we've had a similar sort of acceptability within a tribal structure. So we saw that tribes stuck together. So even though Islam came about in Mecca and Medina and amongst through the Arabian Peninsula, it did not come to remove tribal connections between people. So you could easily be connected to a tribe and also be a Muslim. Or you could be a tribe that's at war with another tribe because of, for whatever reason, yet you both could be Muslims. Both parties could be Muslims. It may be over land or water or the pasture rights of animals or whatever it could be that the particular tribes would have an issue with, but they would split according to tribal lines. And other Muslims were instructed to bring peace between the two of them and try to settle their affairs. So we're seeing that this concept of nationality and nation states is also something which is there. And nationalism also doesn't come to remove religion. Yes, one may argue that nationalism seems to suggest that your priority should always be the nation state. And this is something which really has happened in the last century or so, is the power of the state. And the state becoming more and more powerful and taking more and more rights away from individuals. Instead of being something which would assist the lives of the people, assist the lives of the citizens, it's now become a powerhouse in itself. It serves its own purposes, and now it's not there to serve necessarily the citizens, it's actually there, the elite, who are now using their positions to be able to carry out whatever sort of foreign policy or whatever they want to do, necessarily thinking it's for the betterment of the country, without necessarily consulting the individuals who put them there in power in the first place. So we see this, and this development of nationalism also made its way after the Ottoman Empire into the Muslim world as well. And it didn't sort of give too much problems as such. There didn't seem to be a major rejection of it, a major objection of it, as we've seen. But what we have seen is that nation states have brought about a few changes within the Muslim world. Well, firstly, the nation state granted the government complete authority to interpret and apply the law. And that wasn't the case before. So we've seen throughout these sultan regimes, since the time of the Khulafa Rashidin, what we are seeing is that for the first time now, the actual sort of political element was taking the religious side, the religious authority away from the scholars, and now they were determining law themselves. So that was a big change. The second big change was the concept of citizenship and also the equality before the law moved away a lot of the Islamic legal pluralism which existed. So whereas before the state didn't get involved too much in the law side, they would ask the individual, what law do you adhere to? And if you say, I adhere to the Hanafi law or the Shafi law or the Maliki law, then he would get a qazi of that particular ruling and pass a ruling according to his school. So again, the citizen had some power or authority. Well, now there was a state law. And the state law wasn't just a little bit of Hanafi, a little bit of Maliki, a little bit of Shafi, a little bit of this, a little bit of that mixed together. It was one particular law that was chosen, usually one particular school. So legal pluralism was slowly removed, and the so-called law of the land came about. And the final thing that we saw, particularly with the nation states which came about in the Middle East, which is and where the majority of the Muslims live, was due to an Western influence. And as nation states were already fully operational within the Western world, then what we found is that certain political power elite borrowed the concept of nation states, and with it they also borrowed or took on board a lot of what's called colonizing. And we started to see colonization taking place, and legal codes based on a European understanding of law started to replace the Sharia, with the exception of two areas in particular, which was the family and personal law. So people would still go to the Sharia courts for family and personal law, but when it came to the day-to-day law, what is considered as a crime, what is punishable by the state, things of that nature, slowly we started to see the influence of the Western influences within the way the law was being put together. And that was a huge change we saw there. And the next we look at is, so we're seeing here is this change. And the reason why there wasn't such a huge outcry is because the Muslim population as such, the religiously minded, the religiously elite, tend not to involve themselves too much with the politics. We saw that with going all the way back to the founders of the four schools, in which they had very little to do with the Khalif or the Sultan. In fact, they challenged him. So they've been apolitical, avoiding any form of involvement. And that's the same case with the traditional scholars elite that existed in those days. They had nothing. And as they were taking their cases to the personal law and they were taking it for the family law, then things were fine. It's as time went on, certain individuals then started to use the European courts for the civil and criminal cases rather than going to the Islamic courts. And we started to see some change taking place there. So I have already touched upon the identity so far of a Muslim possessing an identity which is very much based on his territory where he happens to reside. And I've also touched upon an individual's identity when it talks about his religious identity. So let's just discuss that a little bit further. So what we have here now is the identity of Muslims, and we're looking at the concept of the Ummah. And the concept of the Ummah is, and we have to look at identity. Identity for Muslim or for anybody, for a human being, is absolutely essential. It gives a sense of belonging, a stability, it's able to link to one's past, makes the present better understood, and helps us to move towards the future. So, we tend to live around people who we identify in ourselves, or we see ourselves in them. We send our children to places like schools and institutes where we want to impart a certain identity upon them. So literally everything we do, where we socialize, where we live, where we educate ourselves, things of that nature, there is a certain identity that we are imparting on ourselves and those around us. And that is what we tend to do. Faith itself is also an identifier. And it's an identifier. And some may say, well, why do we need faith as an identifier? The reason why we need faith as an identifier is because the faith answers philosophical and moral questions which our national identity can't answer, because the national identity isn't there to give us that understanding. The national identity is restricted to providing a place to reside. So what we see is that so Islam's key point is to bring this equality for men and women in their relationship with Allah. That's the key area. So basically, irrespective of a person's race, ethnicity, tribe, clan, class, nationality, or anything of that nature, these are all secondary. These are not primary. So we don't. So in terms of when we're looking at identity, we don't identify somebody as a man or as a woman, or identify an individual as due to their skin color or ethnicity. The way an individual is identified is their closeness and their relationship with Allah. That's the key identifier. And we see these sorts of things being mentioned, for example, in the sermon of the Prophet ﷺ, where he declared that no Arab has superiority over non-Arab, and no non-Arab over an Arab, neither a white man over a black man, nor a black man over a white man, except in one thing, which is taqwa, which is God consciousness. That's the key point. And we see this concept of ummah mentioned again and again and again. And it's not that this ummah, this identity, came to wipe out all other forms of identity. Far from it. What it did come to do was to bring another identifier which overlies and supersedes above all these other identities. And its point is that everybody is equal in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's eyes, and you determine your closeness, or you determine the height of the quality of your identity by your God consciousness. And that's the point that's being made. So what we've seen is when the Khulafa Rashidin and the Umayyad period, we've seen that Muslims have lived under one leader who had both political elite and also who had political authority and religious authority. But after that time, we've seen leaders, kings, sultans, anything for that nature, which have existed. Yet the Muslims still continue to consider themselves as an ummah, and what they would be able to do is travel freely. There was no sort of border, and this was quite unique for a people. We've only seen things like that in the last few centuries, where we see the United States of America, where various states with similar views, similar identity, similar values has all come together in order to support one another. So even though somebody could be from Texas and somebody could be from another part of the state, another state, they can still have a relationship in the sense that they're all considering themselves as one, but there might be very different ways in which they practice their particular life. So, and likewise we saw with the European Union, the EC, the European Community, which somewhat is breaking down a little bit now, but we also saw there where countries which shared similar values, borders were dropped. So even though nationally, Germany may disagree with Britain, or France may disagree with Spain, but on a more general level, they found that, and that's exactly what we saw, is that there were one ummah and Muslims were free to travel across those lands as they saw fit, because they had equal rights, irrespective of their territorial birthplace or where they continue to live. So we see this concept of ummah, and up until now this hasn't really been highlighted, but what's really been brought into, has really been magnified, is where we start to see certain things which have taken place within the UK in particular, and through the States or in the West, which has now been a means to magnify a potential problem that's existing, that Muslims seem to be giving their priority to their religious identity over their national identity. And things have been mentioned like the Rushdie affair way back in the 80s, the first Gulf War, the issues around faith schools, which some are considered to be isolationist, September the 11 attacks, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, things of that nature. And obviously subsequently to that we see now in Syria as well, and the Arab world very much on fire. So this ummah concept, some see it that it might actually come into conflict with national identities, which are one of individual rights and democracy. So this has raised questions about the allegiance of the Muslims, allegiance to the nation state, and how this could potentially be problematic. However, that's not necessarily the case, because what we tend to see is that there's clear examples in which the Muslims, especially when you take up things like the Rushdie affair, are actually clearly showing their political engagement with the system. And in many of the other cases, they're not isolating themselves and not dealing with it, they're actually stepping forward to deal with it. And we also find, and this is a particular surah, a particular ayah rather, in which we see this Surah Anfal, in which the discussion is given on the 72nd ayat, and it mentions that, and I'll get to the point, when it's discussing about those who make hijrah and spend their wealth and themselves in the path of Allah, they are protectors for one another. But as for those who believe and have not migrated, then it is incumbent upon you to protect them until they migrate. However, if they request help from you with respect to matters of religion, then it is necessary upon you to assist, except if it is regarding a people with whom you have a covenant. So what it's discussing here is that if a group of Muslims living somewhere else have come under attack because of their religion, and this is a key point as well, that it's a religious war. It's not a war based on resources, it's not a war based on territory, but it's a war based on religion. These people are only being attacked because they claim they're Muslims, and they request help from you, but you are sharing a land with a qawm, a people, and you have a covenant with them that you've agreed that you would not attack this particular group of people here. So where these individuals are living, you have made an agreement that you wouldn't attack them. Now, because of this agreement that you have made, you would have to abide by that agreement until obviously you had discussions and revoked that agreement and removed that agreement. Then that's something else. So you can see here that when the this, and obviously this was regarding migration to Medina, but the principles are still there which can be applied in these circumstances. And so we can see this word qawm as well, in which we're seeing qawmiyat, or living in a particular land that you share territorially, and how that goes on. And Shaykh Hussain Madni alayhi rahmah discusses this in great detail in his text Muttahida Qawmiyat or Islam, in which he discusses the debate around the partitioning of India into a secular state and a Hindu state. And he argued upon the identifiers when he was talking about millat and qawm. In the first case, he's talking about millat, which is the religious identity, and qawm, which is referring to a geographical identity, in which he says this could be made up of Muslims, non-Muslims, waghaira. And ummah he considers to be synonymous of millat. And in there he discusses, and he raises some pertinent questions. He acknowledges the pan-Islamic relationship which exists between Muslims. He recognizes the concept of the ummah. But what he does discuss, and he starts to make the point, is can Muslims join in cooperation with non-Muslims in order to form a nation? Furthermore, can they, based on this ittihad qawmiyyat, generally, this is something referred to as composite nationalism, establish economical, political, commercial, agricultural, industrial links? Is there a need for it in India, he says. And then he answers the question himself. He says, there is no doubt that Islam consists of principles that underlie the rectitude of doctrinal, practical and moral matters. Not only is it a means for reforming the individual, but also for the regulation of the particular collective household and the general collective civilized politics. So the general collective is the politics, and the particular collective is the household. It sheds light on all necessities of life, and it provides all forms of regulation. However, we must consider whether Islam, being based on principles which regulate the individual and the collective life, and pertaining to the relationship between the created humans and between humans themselves, permit Muslims to join with non-Muslims as a nationality due to shared residence, race, colour and language. Then due to this relationship, an enemy can be defeated. And he asks more questions just along these lines, and then he responds to these questions. He says, to the extent that we have studied the foundational religious text, it seems clear to us that depending on the situation, this interaction is at times obligatory, at other times recommended, sometimes permissible, disliked, and in some cases illegal. So what he is concluding is the context plays a big part, and there are certain contexts in which it is not only permissible but also recommended, and nay, go as far as saying it is actually obligatory. However, some have Imam Sheikh Zafar Usmani alayhi rahmah has mentioned in his book Ala Sunan that he is sees this qawmiyya muttahida, as he calls it, objectionable. The reason being is that the way he sees it, or the way he understands it, is that this is a ikhtilat tam, yani a complete mixing, assimilation basically taking place, where the cultures are mixed together. And this is something which is not something that is permissible, because either you get a concoction of one religion which is made up of every other religion, or you basically have some inward belief and outwardly everybody looks exactly the same. But this has been the Sheikh's slightly misunderstanding on Sheikh Madani's point of view, and that is because he never referred to a melting point. He was referring to it as integration rather than assimilation. So this concept which is being put forward, and which has been witnessed, to be honest, across the history of Muslims, in fact very much early on after the passing of the last of the Khalif, Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, we're seeing this concept of political authority, geographical identity, and also then a religious identity. And we've seen that throughout the history of Islam, whereas apart from the, as I said, the first sort of 30 years under the Khulafa, and then the century or so where we had one supreme leader, After that point, really, there's been many nations, if you can use that word, many khilaf, many sultanates that have claimed this leadership. So we've sort of come to some kind of understanding, which is that even though nation state as a whole is alien to Islam, it doesn't understand the concept of dividing lands up depending on some sort of arbitrary lines or some view that this particular group of people should be together, this particular group of people together. Even though that doesn't understand it, because usually it's as far as the person can defend that land, then that becomes his land. But we live in a modern world, so nation state is something which can be accepted as a means, and it has really, because across the Muslim world we see individuals accepting that particular understanding. But what we are finding ourselves now is the Muslims living in non-Muslim nation states. One is Muslims living in nation states that are predominantly Muslim, and Muslims have the power to bring about laws which is according to their religious beliefs. But what about the case where Muslims are living in non-Western lands? So a number of questions which come up, which I'll hope to address in the part 2 of this traditional usul and political legal jurisdictions. So the questions which come up is, if Britain is based on secular principles, is it permissible for a Muslim to live there? Can Muslims show allegiance to a non-Muslim, or more generally to a non-religious leadership? Are Western countries the abode of war, Darul Harb, as we saw in the books of fiqh and as in the centuries ago, or that which is being suggested by sort of extreme groups in both camps? If so, what form of relationship should a Muslim maintain with the state and the indigenous population? Well, that's what we're going to explore, but we're going to explore that in the next part. And the way we're going to look at in the next part, or the following episode, part 2 of this Diyar, is we're going to look at, remind you again of the 3 interpretive models: the literal approach, the liberal approach, and the traditional approach. And we're going to apply these approaches to Western states and see what conclusion we get. Because that's the context we need. Once we have the context, then one will better understand how a Muslim can reside in those. So I hope you can watch the next part 2 of this traditional usul and political legal jurisdictions, which will be the following episode, inshallah, in which we will discuss that in great detail. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح، تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح، وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح، يسعك الفضاء الرحيم.